In December 1942, months before the men of Easy Company ever boarded an aircraft for combat, they took part in one of the most grueling feats of endurance in the history of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. It was a test that forged the battalion into a unified fighting force, earned national attention, and left nearly every man barely able to walk. Surprisingly, this remarkable event was never depicted in the HBO series Band of Brothers. As the 506th prepared to leave Camp Toccoa for Fort Benning, Colonel Robert Sink shared a story that immediately captured the regiment's imagination. He had recently read in Reader's Digest that a Japanese Army battalion had marched 100 miles down the Malay Peninsula in just 72 hours. Sink believed his paratroopers could surpass that achievement. Major Robert Strayer confidently volunteered his 2nd Battalion for the challenge. The terms were simple. 1st and 3rd Battalions would ride comfortably to Fort Benning by train. 2nd Battalion would march the entire distance on foot. If they succeeded, they would claim both the endurance record and the prestige that came with it. For the men of Dog, Easy, and Fox companies, along with battalion headquarters, it was both an honor and a punishment. At 7 a.m. on December 1, 1942, 586 officers and enlisted men stepped out of Camp Toccoa. Every soldier carried a full field pack, weapon, ammunition, and all required gear. Riflemen were heavily burdened. Men in mortar and machine gun sections carried even more weight. Major Strayer chose a 118-mile route, most of it along unpaved country roads through rural Georgia. The weather quickly turned miserable. Cold rain soaked the men. At times, rain turned to snow. Dirt roads became slick ribbons of mud. Men slipped, cursed, and pushed forward. David Webster, who served in Fox Company at the time, later recalled soldiers slogging through mud while counting down the minutes to each brief halt. By 11 p.m., the battalion had covered roughly 40 miles. Strayer selected a campsite atop a barren hill with no trees and no protection from the wind. Temperatures dropped into the low 20s Fahrenheit. The field kitchen failed to light its stoves, so the exhausted men were given only bread spread with jam. When they tried to rest, many found little relief from the freezing cold. At 6 a.m., the men woke to a landscape coated in frost. Boots had frozen solid. Soldiers removed their laces to force swollen feet inside. Weapons and equipment were literally frozen to the ground. Most assumed Major Strayer, who looked more like a businessman than a hardened field officer, would ride in a vehicle for the 2nd day. Instead, he took his place at the front and continued marching. That decision began to change opinions. Donald Malarkey later told a memorable story from the march. During a break, a woman standing near a farmhouse offered the troops water. Malarkey was desperately thirsty. Captain Herbert Sobel had forbidden the men from crossing roads during rest stops, but Malarkey could not resist. He dashed across the road, filled 2 canteens, and spotted Sobel charging toward him. "I want that man's name!" Sobel shouted. Fortunately for Malarkey, the column began moving, and marching soldiers blocked Sobel's path. Malarkey slipped back into formation unnoticed. By the 3rd day, enthusiasm had faded. There were still 38 miles remaining, and much of that distance would be covered on paved roads leading into Atlanta. Concrete proved far harsher on battered feet than mud. That night, the battalion bivouacked on the grounds of Oglethorpe University. Coincidentally, a detachment of the Women's Army Corps was training there, which briefly boosted morale. The men, however, were too exhausted to do much more than collapse. Malarkey and Warren Muck crawled into their pup tent. When supper was announced, Malarkey was unable to stand and had to crawl to the mess line. Lieutenant Richard Winters suggested he ride the ambulance for the remainder of the march. Malarkey refused. He would finish under his own power. News of the march had spread across Georgia through newspapers and radio broadcasts. As the battalion approached downtown Atlanta, cheering crowds lined the streets. Major Strayer arranged for a marching band to meet the men 1 mile from the finish. Despite their pain, the sound of the music transformed the column. Shoulders squared, heads lifted, and the battalion marched into the city with parade ground precision. The battalion completed 118 miles in 75 hours. Their actual marching time totaled 33 hours and 30 minutes, an average pace of about 4 miles per hour. Of the 586 men who left Camp Toccoa, only 12 failed to finish. Colonel Sink proudly told reporters that every man completed the route, stretching the truth only slightly. The Japanese record had been decisively broken. Lieutenant Moore's 3rd platoon was the only platoon in the entire battalion in which every man completed every step. As a reward, they were given the honor of leading the parade through Atlanta. The battalion was granted a 3-day pass. Most of the men spent it sleeping. According to the 506th Regimental scrapbook, only meals could coax them out of bed. Few had the energy to explore the area or even walk to watch the jump towers. Throughout the 118 miles, the men cursed Major Strayer and questioned his sanity. In retrospect, many acknowledge that the march was one of the defining experiences of their training. It taught them that they could endure far more than they believed possible. It forged a shared identity within the battalion, and it earned Major Strayer lasting respect because he marched every step at the front and demanded nothing from his men that he would not do himself. Long before Normandy, before Bastogne, and before the liberation of Europe, Easy Company proved to themselves that they could overcome extreme hardship together. That lesson would serve them for the rest of the war.